and I'll mute everyone, and then I'll mute me and Eva.
Just give me the thumbs up when I should start talking, Mike.
Off you go, Mira.
I have to apologize that my internet seems to be unstable at the moment. I can't tell if you guys, I'm guessing maybe not.
We can hear you intermittently.
You can. Okay. Well, I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to Kol Nefesh virtually, and especially pleased to welcome Dr. Eva Frojmovic. We're very, very thrilled that Eva has agreed to come on and give us this tour of the Polin Museum. Eva is the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Leeds, and also one of the leading members of Leeds Masorti. And I just discovered today that we also have a familial connection, a tenuous familial connection to Kol Nefesh, because Eva is the wife of one of Laura Ostrov's cousins. I believe I've got that right.
Correct. So, you got that right.
Hello. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Eva, and Eva, you can take it away. Thank you.
Okay. Right. So, Mike, I'm going to leave you to, look out for people who join late and are not muted. If you could do that, I think there might be some people who join a little bit, who join a little bit later. And of course, if you can't hear me, then you can't hear me saying that. If you can't hear me, you should type in the chat. But so I'll just quickly say hello, introduce myself, and then I hope you're sitting comfortably. Hang on, Meira and Mike, please, would you tell me what's the longest you'd like me to speak, so that I don't outstay my welcome? I can always come back and do the second part another time.
Yeah.
Roughly.
Why don't you, when we hit, say, the hour mark, let's see.
Okay.
I'm not sure if you heard that. My internet is bad.
You did.
Yes, I did. Okay. So very quickly, I initially thought that this is just a kind of an academic talk. But of course, it's much more than that. It's very personal, like perhaps many of the people who are present. I also have Polish roots, Polish Jewish roots of a sort, in that my mother's paternal grandfather was from Berdichev, but of course Berdichev is now in Ukraine, so I think at last report it was. So these things are very fluctuating. So there is a kind of family connection. But actually, when I visited the museum in 2018, I hadn't really thought that through. I hadn't really considered it. So this is some of this, even though we're talking 2 years ago and more, is still half digested. So I'll just say a word about myself. I was born in a country that doesn't exist anymore, which is Czechoslovakia. So my first language is not Polish, but Czech. But of course, it's not a million miles away. One can work things out. We ran away when I was a child, ran away from the communists, and ended up in Germany, which is a supreme irony given that both of my parents in different ways are Holocaust survivors. But that's for another day. And I came to England in the early 90s. I have my background is I'm an art historian. So the visual plays a big role for me. That's how I relate to a museum in the first place. But I'm also a bit of a historian as well. I have an MA in history as well. So, a little bit of both. And I came to England on a postdoc. I didn't know what was going to happen, but then I got this job here in Leeds. And in Leeds, I look after Jewish studies, but I'm also deeply connected to cultural studies, and I'm deeply connected to museum and heritage, critical museum and heritage studies. So I have learned a lot since coming to Leeds. Now, Polin. So I was in Warsaw in 2018 because for years, I'd sort of not really wanted to go back to Poland rather. I was in Poland when I was 3 years old in 1965, when my father, my mother and I my father returned to Auschwitz in order to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the 1945, and to pay homage to those members of his family, including his father, who were murdered in Auschwitz. And I hadn't been back since then. And of course, it doesn't count. I was 3. What did I know? For a long time, I couldn't quite face it. In 2018, there was a conference in Krakow, and I thought, well, Krakow, okay, so I went, and then we decided, my husband came with me, and we decided to spend a couple of days, 3 days also in Warsaw after that. I still have not been back to Auschwitz, by the way. I did not go to Auschwitz on that 2018 trip. It's something that I still can't do. I'm sorry. So we can all only do what we can do. But we spent 2 solid days in Polin. That is the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, which was a very intense experience, which for me was mediated by 2 things. One is I actually teach about this material. So I run a final year undergraduate and an MA class about Jewish museums up here in Leeds. So this was obviously central and important. And I had a way in because I had had the privilege of learning from a great friend and scholar, Barbara Kirchenblatt-Gimblet, to whom I'm profoundly indebted also for this talk. So without further ado, shall I start? Or is there something else that you'd like to know about me that I haven't said? Okay.
No, I think go ahead and start.
Share. Here we are. So actually, I think I'm going to skip some of this, and I'm going to start straight here, and then we can backtrack and talk about the politics, because it is intensely political. Okay, sorry. Right, so I'll come back to that later. Okay, so just as a quick overview, the background, the history leading up towards the opening of the museum, towards the creation of the museum, is very much to do with the end of the Cold War and the end of communism in Poland, 1989. Various sort of stepping stones on the way. There was a big temporary exhibition in Berlin in 1992 called Jüdische Lebenswelten, Jewish life worlds. And the history of, I've got it here, and the history of the Polish Jews was not really included. And so this was a bit of a wake-up call. And then in 1993, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington having been opened, Polish scholars were able to visit it, and it gave them an idea. This was although the museum has a collection, the narrative, the way what the museum tries to get across is not really collection based or not collection driven, but rather narrative driven, wanting to tell a story. And this was the idea that was then realized in Polin. We can talk about the relationship between narrative and collection later on. The Polin Museum does have a collection. It's sometimes misunderstood not to have one. It does. But the way it communicates is driven by a narrative, wanting to tell a story, which is the story of 1,000 years of Polish Jewish history. Polish Jewish history, the history of Polish Jews, is not the same as the history of the Jews in Poland, because Poland, of course, has in the past been an unstable entity with borders that expanded and contracted. And so it is easier to speak of Polish Jews who are now also an international community. Okay, 2003, the Polish government gave its declaration of support, which was also financial support, of course. They, in fact, the city of Warsaw made available this plot of land, about whose location we'll talk in a minute. The museum building opened in 2013. This is abbreviated. And then the core exhibition, which is what I'm going to mostly be talking about, opened in 2014. Now on the right, you can see that Dariusz Stolar was the first director until last year. And this is, of course, an intensely, then his vice director, deputy director, succeeded him. And this is an intensely political story, including a scandal about which I'd love to talk perhaps at the end. I was going to start with it, but I'll talk about it towards the end instead. So just a quick word about the design. What is essential is that the museum is directly opposite the ghetto memorial. Hang on, I think this is a friend phoning me saying, where is the link to my talk? Oh, no, it's fine, she got it. The Ghetto Memorial, which was erected in 1948. This is a deeply symbolic location, because the Ghetto Memorial is a place which certainly traditionally no foreign politician or diplomat could visit Warsaw without laying a wreath at the Ghetto Memorial. So it is a place, it is a profoundly political place. And so this ensemble that these two buildings form, on the right, my own photos are hardly professional, but at least they get across what I'm trying to say. So here you can see this space between the museum on the left, and you can just glimpse the memorial on the right. The upper one is taken from the memorial towards the museum. The memorial is of course double-sided. I've got a whole nother talk about the memorials of Warsaw for another day. The prize winners was a Finnish film, and I won't say very much about the architecture except that it's a combination of geometric and organic. They were looking for something somewhat organic, some warmth of this sort of cave-like structure of drawing people in. And then it's actually the permanent exhibition, the core exhibition is actually underground mostly. Okay, so here just another view of showing you, and of course we are, where are we? We are in what used to be once the Jewish quarter and then the Jewish ghetto, that is the Nazi ghetto. And the reason why you can, why there is this space that was available and these modern buildings in the background has to do with the utter and total destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto by the Nazis during and in the final course of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1943. It was a destruction which was so thorough that it was in some places impossible to reconstruct the course of the former streets even. So I'm going to leave it at that, but we're talking about the Muranov district, which has an old Jewish historical presence, had an old Jewish historical presence reaching back into the 19th century. Okay, so this is not good enough, so I'm going to leave this out. Okay, so the starting point, 1,000 years of the history, heritage, and culture of Polish Jews. So the idea is that this was supposed to not be just about the Holocaust, but a more holistic image of the Polish Jews. Okay, so the concept was the so-called narrative museum, which is different from something like the British Museum, which is very much a collection-based museum. The narrative museum had been pioneered by Yeshaya Weinberg in Washington, and this was an inspiration. Yeah, okay, and then of course there is a collection, there is an increased collection program, and also a Judaica database, which is aiming to digitize its holdings and which is in progress. And on the left, you can see the mezuzah of the museum. That's the thing that looks a little bit like a brick. It's actually a very large mezuzah. So that marks this building as symbolically a Jewish space of sorts. Okay, I'm going to actually skip this one. That was the menu on the day that you see on the right, but I'm not going to discuss it. Right, so the plan of the core exhibition galleries works in a kind of circular manner, which is you descend down and you begin in, can you see my cursor when I point something out?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Okay, good. I wasn't sure, if I pointed something. So the plan works roughly in a kind of circular manner. You descend from street level, you go down, and you begin in this space, which is the mythical space of the forest, which is essentially before history. The Polish forest as a place of arrival, of wandering, of arrival and of rest, which is legend, not history. And then you enter the historical space of the first encounters in the early Middle Ages. I'll take you through it properly. If we were there, we wouldn't be able to do this. So I'm going to do a mini tour first, and then I'll take you through it step by step. First encounters, first settlement, the so-called the paradise of the Jews, which is the kind of the Renaissance period, the world of the shtetl, the first encounters with modernity. So that's about the 19th century. The street, that's very much about, especially about interwar Jewish life, urban life, in the move to the cities, urbanization. and then a gradual zooming in on actually the street life, the city life of Warsaw specifically, followed, so that's the interwar period, followed by the Holocaust, the war years, the Holocaust years, which is a complicated space that goes up and down again for a reason, which I'll show you later. And then finally, the post-war years. And then you emerge up again into an upper space, which has special temporary exhibitions. So that's the rough overview, just so that you have a sense that the arrangement is, it is on the one hand chronological, but on the other hand, it's also thematic. It has themes. It's not just a passage of time. Each time has its theme. It's what they call chronothematic, a chronothematic approach. Okay, I'm going to leave this out because this is too much detail. And I'm just going to take you in, and we can interrogate specific points later. Just make a note of any questions you've got, and I'm happy to go into things later on. I'd love you to challenge me. My interpretation is only my interpretation. It's very strongly influenced by Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet, but I know that there are many other ways of looking at this museum. So these are my own snapshots on that day, which was July 2018, on those 2 days actually, and it was very hot. So you get this sense of this tremendous expanse of glass and stone with the sun sort of blazing in, but otherwise a very bare space, and you don't have to go downstairs. So you descend. The photo on the right is my own snapshot, just going down the stairs. And here you can, on the middle and the left and the middle, you can see a comparison between the original design that had been planned to create a forest with sort of tree trunks and things, and then the actual installation, which are screens on which the views and also the sounds, the light and the sounds of the forest are projected. And I think that's probably preferable. I think the original plan might have been a little bit too Disney-like. So I'm very glad that that they didn't go for the tree trunks. So we go down and we enter a space of historical imagination inspired by this legend, which was a Polish legend, which explains the name, the Hebrew name of Poland, Polin. Here you shall take a rest, which is of course a folk etymology of how Poland got its name, a Jewish etymology of the name of Poland. So first encounters and first settlements. It's first encounters first, because the first Jewish people who wrote about Poland were not people who settled there, but travelers. Travelers from, in some cases, from very distant countries. And the way in which these spaces operate is very deliberately theatrical. It's what Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet calls the theater of history, which unfolds as you walk into it, which is a dynamic and an immersive space, which is, some of it is kind of multimedia, but it's not just about multimedia. It's a combination of objects, of real objects, of fake objects, of things that were built for this exhibition. But what is important is that at every point, and I apologize for my photo, it was a bit dark there, and my camera wasn't that great. At every point, you are faced with quotes. with primary sources in their primary languages, whether they're Hebrew or Arabic or German or whatever, with a Polish and an English translation. So the desire to make the primary sources speak verbatim is very much part of the need of this museum to establish what they call a zone of trust, or a trusted zone, a trusted space. Because, as we'll see in a minute, the museum does tell conflicting stories, and these stories are conflicting the more we get into and towards the present. So here on the left, you can see Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, and indeed, I can't read the Arabic, but you know, he was Jewish, but it's, you know, we get the original source. The lands of the Slavs stretch from the Syrian Sea to the ocean northwards. The lands of the Slavs are the coldest of all. Oh well, little did he know. When the nights are moonlit and the days clear, the most severe frosts occur. It is then that the frost intensifies and the ice congeals. Okay, so this was a traveler of the 10th century. Maps help to imagine how travelers traveled. For example, the travels of Benjamin of Tudela, who was well, you know, he went a long way. He called Poland Canaan, which is quite funny. He came from the Iberian Peninsula, and he went on a long trip, and excerpts from his book are available for you to turn the pages and to read as while you're there. So here you can see some more examples of the ways in which Jewish as well as non-Jewish sources are quoted verbatim in order to kind of, you know, gain authenticity. But objects are also present, but some of them are very small, right? They're tiny. You can't make an exhibition and make an impression. Some of them are loans from the Archaeological Museum. You can't make an exhibition with just these objects. If you want to tell a story, you have to fill in the gaps. So this leads in some cases to the rebuilding of medieval buildings that are actually located elsewhere. Here on the right, you can see coins from the 13th century that were coined by Jewish mint masters, but the original is tiny. You can't see anything. So they blow it up so that you can see it. And, you know, you can look at the Hebrew. And I then was able to virtually mint my own coin, which was an interesting experience. The medieval section does certainly not shy away from difficult topics around the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, between the polemics between Christians and Jews. I'm showing you here on the left, a copy of a Christian altarpiece that shows Jesus in the temple, surrounded by rabbi types who may or may not be depicted in a stereotypical manner. And that's then for the viewer to mull over and consider. The pattern of Trzemeszno, which shows the church and the synagogue, blind synagogue at the crucifixion. And very interesting, the so-called Krakow Bible, which I've always known as the Regensburg Pentateuch, now in the Israel Museum. So there's a politics of naming the objects, which is very interesting. Excerpts from laws, which specify how Jews were treated in legal sources, what the law was that applied to them. And of course, there is a certain amount of illusionism going on. You know, these things are made to look as if they were the actual medieval document, which of course they're not, but to just get you into the spirit. So there are some things that perhaps, you know, I would have liked to add in. So for example, this is about the medieval Jewish quarter. That's these two pictures, left and bottom right, which explain about also, which explain about the composition, you know, the synagogue and the mikvah, the community board, the kosher slaughter, the cemetery, etc., etc. But I would have liked the museum perhaps, or maybe it's there, maybe I just didn't spot it, to actually include a photo of where they discuss the medieval synagogue of Olesnica that was converted to a Protestant church. It's still there, but I found the photo somewhere else, so I'm supplying it here. So I'm adding things in here that, that I'm not sure I saw in the museum. The third section, Paradisus Judaeorum, covers the late, you know, the Renaissance period, the paradise of the Jews between 1565 roughly and the fatal year of 1648. We get models, city models, the model of the city of Krakow with the Jewish city of Kazimierz. Okay. And in this early sort of, let's say the Renaissance, early modern period, the great draw are the printing presses, where, as you can see in these two photos, adults and children are able to print and then take home their own page of a Hebrew book, usually a beautiful decorated title page, which is a copy of an actual title page of one of these, the books that were printed during the heydays in the 16th and 17th century, the heroic period of Hebrew printing in the Kingdom of Poland. And it's accompanied by a map to show that this was the paradise for the Jews, because it coincided with a great expansion, in parts quite an aggressive expansion, a growth of the Kingdom of Poland, which grew bigger and bigger until, but we're not there yet. But at the same time, we also learn about some of the more horrible things that were also printed at this time, such as, strictly and crudely anti-Jewish, blood libel myths, which are here depicted with these two Jews wielding knives. So these worlds coexisted, and what's important is that the museum shows both sides. So here on the right, kind of reimagined yeshiva. This is all about learning. On the left, an original volume. Here, one of book that was studied. I've photographed it and included it here. That's top left of my slide, because I then got a little closer, and I looked at the ex libris stamp, the owner's stamp, and blow me down, it reads Jews College London. So that's a recent entry into the museum, and that's for another day. We can talk about Jews College London and its lost library another time. But because the world of learning was such a male world, the museum is careful to also speak about books for women, to talk about Yiddish books that were targeting Jewish women, so that women are not left out of this story. Right, I'm going to skip this. And I'm going to speak very quickly about the corridor of fire, where I do wish I had taken a sound recording, because you walk through a narrow corridor and you hear the horrible sound of horses, weapons, yelling, crying, fire. It's an absolutely apocalyptic scene, which relates to the Chmielnicki massacres of 1648. And you walk through with the left-hand picture on your left, with quotes and excerpts from Jewish sources, Nathan Hanover, the so-called chronicle called Abyss of Despair, which he as a survivor wrote afterwards, and a Christian, Christian vision on the right, and some weapons. I've squeezed it all into this slide. So you squeeze your way through this corridor of fire, which is really a visceral experience. And you come into the Jewish town. And I sort of thought, oh, really? Not the shtetl again, the myth, the mythology of the shtetl, which was a whole kind of a world that was wholesome and happy. But actually, because the Jewish town, the shtetl, comes after the corridor of fire, it's a bit of a less of a romantic image, because one realized that these people were survivors of some really horrendous experiences. So that puts things into perspective. On the right, I'm just showing another vitrine showing that the museum certainly does display actual objects. Not, it's a mixture of scenography, of museum as theater, theater as museum, but also serious real objects. So the marketplace and the Jewish town is, of course, between synagogue and church. So nothing is left out. The synagogue is important, but the hostile presence of the church and the negative influence of preaching is explicitly addressed, and I've got that in the right-hand slide, which is a church, and which talks about the preaching and the Jesuits and whatever. On the left, however, I'm showing you something which is a little bit different from this scenography, which are essentially, kind of plasterboard buildings, because this very multicolored synagogue on the left, I pronounce it Gwoździec, I'm happy to be corrected. The synagogue of Gwoździec was actually, over several years, rebuilt of real wood, real paint, partially rebuilt in using the traditional methods and traditional wood building by volunteers from all over Poland, and some international volunteers as well. So that was a very, very interesting project, which was not just about display, but about the making of this thing and making something together, remaking in this case. I'm showing you on the right another snapshot of mine, which shows that it's a partial rebuilding. So it's just the roof and the bima that was rebuilt, not the whole building, and painted by hand. And from the upper floor, you can see that the roof, so on the left, you see the roof construction above the vault, which you can see on the right, above the painted vault. And that was deliberately left unfinished, with a lot of documentation around it, explaining what the sources were that enabled this rebuilding, because Gwoździec synagogue was exceptionally well documented already in the late 19th century. There are also some early photographs. There were watercolors giving you all the detail with the color scheme, so that it was possible. But the irony, it was possible to recreate it. The irony is, of course, that Gwoździec is not in Poland today. It's in the Ukraine. I'm just going to move on. I realize that I'm leaving a lot of things unresolved because we don't have much time, and I'm going to move us on.
Can I just say it's Gwoździec? Gwoździec, because when in Polish you would say for a W it would be a V, So Gwoździec.
Right. Gwoździec, is that better?
Gwoździec. It's like Gwoździec.
Like Geweret, Gwoździec.
Gwoździec. Okay, that's easy. Gwoździec, that's easy. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm invariably influenced by my Czech, by my Czech habits. So it's worse than starting from zero. Thank you very much for that. But I've checked. It's now in the Ukraine, which is another irony. And I'd love to hear how they pronounce it. That would be another interesting question. Okay, so modernity starts really with the dismembering of Poland between the three big Central European powers, which you can see in portraits here. Maria Theresa of Austria, the King of Prussia. Oh gosh, I've just got a momentary, I'm sorry, and the Tsar. Yeah, thank you. Oof. But I'm sorry, I just can't remember his name now. Okay, so Russia, Poland, Russia, Austria, and Prussia gradually between 1772 and the end of the 18th century, they carve up the Poland cake between them, and it by and by disappears almost completely. So that's the starting point for encounters with modernity. The other big pattern is, of course, industrialization. On the right, the recreation of a train station. I'll come back to that. So the way that the narrative is integrated is very interesting, because the story of the Besht and the beginnings of Hasidism are subsumed under encounters with modernity. It's not how I used to think about it. I used to think about Hasidism as a kind of survival of something pre-modern. And what the museum is emphasizing is that no, actually, both Hasidism and in some ways, other trends in strictly Orthodox Judaism, they were part of their time, and they were also engagements in one way or another with modernity. So that's just these two aspects. Weddings. So here again, I thought, oh no, it's going to be one of these naive, romantic rooms where the Jewish wedding is explained as something to do with the good old days. But that's not really the case. In fact, the weddings are depicted as an arena of social change and not as something timeless. And I can't illustrate this here properly, but the changing role of the matchmaker versus new ideas about love and finding one's match are all played out around this room. I'd love to say a little bit more about these two objects on the left, the wedding bread and the decorated wedding bread and the plate, and especially about the collection that they come from. But I'm just going to leave that. And if people want to talk to me about the provenance of these two objects and many others, I'll happily do that, because that is a tragedy in itself. The collection of Maximilian Goldstein survived, but the family and Maximilian himself were wiped out. So new ideas around learning and becoming educated and Haskalah come into this, and all the, I suppose, the tensions between radically different visions of how Jewish people should live are played out in these different rooms, because the conflict between the forces of, let's say, Hasidism on the one hand, and on the other hand, Haskalah, that is the Jewish Enlightenment, were profound. Okay, so.
Dr. Eva, sorry
yes.
to disturb you. Are you taking questions now, or can we answer questions as you're going along?
So maybe, shall I just pause in the, okay, yeah, I'll just pause now if you like. I'll pause in the train station, and then we can talk about the modern period. Sure, by all means.
I have a question.
Shall I stop sharing?
Oh, no, it's fine. It's fine. I have a question actually about the previous slide, because you were talking about the beginning of modernism with the 3 paintings. What I was interested in is what the museum says about the partition of Poland, because Poland was obviously partitioned into 3, and then it ceased to actually exist for 123 years until 1918. So between 1975 and 1918, there actually wasn't a Poland on the map of Europe. And I wanted to ask, as it's always been a question to me, how that obviously affected the population of Poland, and in turn the Jewish population, because each section of the landmass was shared between these ruling parties, and it was brutal. The Russian partition was extremely brutal. The Austrian-Hungarian was brutal. It took over. That's why Krakow is the way it is today, because of obviously the construction, and obviously the Prussian, the German.
Okay, I'll try and answer that, Katie.
Sorry. So I just wanted to ask that question.
Yeah. Okay. So I think you've put your finger on something which is indeed a problem, and I think, on the one hand, I'm taking it back to this idea that it's the history of the Polish Jews, rather than necessarily the history of the Jews in Poland. But at the same time, there is a way in which the museum inevitably, because it has a chronology and it has a way of going forward through historical time, it does emphasize continuity. And it bridges this gap in a way by insisting that in some way, these people, some of the Jewish people in, let's say, Łódź, it claims them for being Polish Jews rather than, let's say, Austrian or Prussian Jews. So does that answer your question? Yeah, so that is a gray area here, which I think we just need to hold on to, just like portions of the world of the shtetl took place under the rule of the Tsars in the so-called Pale of Settlement. So yeah, so that is very true. Yeah, so a lot of this world, there wasn't such a thing as a Polish. Well, maybe a little bit after, but he was born around 1700, so a little bit after. Yeah, you're right. Poland as a state ends.
Yeah, it's a question that I think about quite often, because I think about the Polish language being deleted from the whole of the Europe. Like, it was illegal to talk Polish for 123 years. The only place you could speak Polish was, I think, in a religious environment. So that's why the Poles and the churches remain quite strong, because there was a lot of rebellion, and obviously there were lots of rebellions during this period, and people were fighting for more religions in these rebellions, because obviously they wanted their country back.
Yeah.
So this was
I will get onto that in just a minute, by the way. If you just give me 1 second. So I'm just going to detour for a minute to talk about industrialization, because some of this occupied Poland, this kind of divided up Poland, was quite, especially the portions that were under Prussia and under Austria, were quite sort of aggressively almost developed. There was a lot of industrialization going on, which was driven from these, from the respective powers. And these were then also boundless opportunities, as well as a source of endless poverty. So I'm showing how actually the museum tries to show both sides without idealizing them, and showing that, in Lodz everything is possible, as Sholem Aleichem used to say. But on the other hand, the incredible poverty that you get at the same time, this shocking contrast between, the Poznański palace and the penniless artist. I don't know how penniless he was, but Samuel Hirschenberg, who, he got some money, but very little for painting this rather shocking palace. So these contrasts, and of course, this is in some ways, a profoundly French building that Israel Poznański erected for himself. So I think, since we are talking about the problem of the Poland that is not allowed to exist in a way, this posed some, fairly radical decisions for Polish people, but also for Jewish people. Emigration versus patriotism. So on the left, I'm showing the various destinations of emigration, especially between 1881 and 1914, from the various components of former Poland. And on the other hand, the Jewish fighters for Polish independence, which that's another difficult topic, because the independence fighters of the various portions of the 19th century are now enormously celebrated in post-communist Poland, but their Jewish members are not always included. They're included in this museum, but they're not always included. And of course, if they were decorated, well, this is normal in Europe, with a cross, which I suppose it's a nice thing to have, I guess. And then finally, sorry, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, 1918, the recreation of the new Poland at the end of World War I. And what was it? What did it mean for the Jewish people? On the one hand, tremendous opportunities. On the other hand, it was also accompanied by attacks, bloody attacks on Jewish people. So a very messy and complicated beginning, with lots and lots of issues to do with questions to do with how to find one's identity as a Jewish person in the new Poland. So that period is then addressed in the Jewish street. I'm showing here both the designs and the mock-ups, and then the way it plays out, where you walk into spaces and you learn about Jewish politics. Actually, the thing about Jewish politics that really stayed with me is this photo, the one on the right, which shows all the parties that Jewish people were asked to vote for, just the Jewish parties. It's just unbelievable, the kind of the unbelievable fragmentation of Jewish politics is just tremendous. I just had to include this photo. So it's about politics. It's about coffee house politics. Coffee house was recreated. It's about entertainment. Here, my husband is trying to learn to dance the waltz. It's about the flowering of cinema in Yiddish. Yiddish cinema for some people, but of course other forms of cinema in other cases. It's about the many possibilities for Jewish schooling, the many decisions to be made. What kind of a school, if at all a Jewish school, often not, Jewish children would go to, what kind of youth movement they would, the incredible fragmentation, what kind of youth movement they would join. That's in these two photos. Okay, I'm going to skip this actually, because we just don't have enough time. We really don't have enough time. I've got, right, I've got lots more material. And I think bringing these two together, anybody who wants to read more, there's a very, very dense book called Who Will Write Our History by Samuel Kassow, Kassow, which I recommend because it shows how the tremendous multivocality, the many voices of Jewish belonging, Jewish identity, Jewish politics found their expression and their continuation within the Warsaw Ghetto. And I think what you can definitely see here, that suddenly color has gone, right? So it's quite a deliberate change in the aesthetic. Color has gone. This is very much a black and white space, a place of humiliation, labeling, forced labor, and then finally extermination, which is meticulously documented here, including the pernicious structures that were used in order to control and deceive Jews and deceive each other. And you can see here the use of this stark aesthetic of the black and white, the bare concrete, the slanting angles, right? This isn't me, this is actually slanting angles of the, of the shapes of the doors and the corridors. Nothing is straight, everything is disconcerting. The reason why on the left, I'll just be a few more minutes, I'm nearly done. Why this tram, the streetcar, the tram was included, which I'm showing you here on the left, was to say that non-Jewish people took the tram through the ghetto and they could see what was going on. And the ghetto was bisected by this tram line, and there was a bridge from one bit of the ghetto to another, so that the Nazi ghetto was never totally sealed off. Non-Jewish people could have seen through the windows if they had wanted to. And equally, this is the view from the ghetto bridge, reconstituted with photographs, looking down and seeing that there is another life going on in which people, non-Jewish people, walk their dogs, sell balloons, an unimaginable world that is happening in parallel with this hell of the ghetto. I have more to say about the ghetto, but I can't. We can do this in the break. On the left, I'm showing here part of the Ringelblum archive, the Oinig Shabbos archive, which was a form of resistance where Jewish intellectuals in the ghetto got together and say, we are not going to survive this, but we can document it. We're going to hide the documents. We're going to dig them into some cellars, and somebody one day is going to find them. And many of those have been found and are now in the Jewish Historical Institute. The right-hand slide shows the multiple self-help organizations that operated in the ghetto until the ghetto uprising. I think it's important to talk about the post-war years because although 90% of the Jewish community was murdered, nevertheless, something like 230,000 Jewish people came back, were there immediately after the war. And so there is a serious question, what happened to them? On the left, bottom left, stay or leave, right? Many of them left after, very quickly around 1948. Others tried to leave in the 50s, and then there was another big exodus in 1968 during some anti-Semitic outrages. And here, this is a kind of a multimedial corridor that you walk through, and you hear through the loudspeakers these ugly anti-Zionist rhetorics propagated by anti-Semitic politicians in Poland, and you understand why stay or leave, was. And then here, all the possibilities. What does Israel mean to you? What creates Jewish culture and faith? Is there a future for Jews in Poland? All the questions that people were asking themselves at the same time, at that time, and you can record your thoughts and you can listen to other thoughts, to other people's thoughts. There's quite a bit really interesting material about the post-war cultural kind of formation and politics of Jews in Poland, including artists who say things like, I had no reason to make paintings other than this one, in order to expel the nightmare which is eating into me and which is making me die every day, together with the ones I have lost. So here the question of, this is not people moving on. This is a question of how to live with the memory. And I'm going to stop here 2 minutes after 9. I'm going to stop here with an unforgettable experience that I went through, which is at the end of these 2 days, it was the eve of Tisha B'Av. And so I'm showing you on the left. Sorry, my photos are bad because, in the night didn't work terribly well. The 9th of Av commemoration ceremony in the night at the Ghetto Monument on the 21st of July. And then the next day, the March of Memory, which that would be another talk. So I'm going to stop there and let people ask questions, more contributions, disagreements, problems, issues. I know things are complicated. I'll just stop sharing for a minute. Are you still there?
I have a question about the anti-Semitism question in Poland.
Wait, can I just pause you for a second? Who is chairing the questions?
Oh.
Mike or Mira?
Mike, can you see everybody? Can you see if everybody raises their hand?
Okay, so the idea is, how do people raise their hand?
Yeah, I think just raise your hand, or you can use the Zoom the Zoom hand raise tool. And if you've raised your hand and we don't see you, just
then we have a problem, right?
Yeah.
oh, so Katie?
Yeah, I have a question because this is something that's very fascinating and extremely passionate for me, since my grandfather was in Auschwitz and I have, a huge interest in this. Dr. Eva, what do you think about the idea of the anti-Semitism that you raised in Poland during the post-war? Obviously, this was a totalitarian communist Iron Curtain government, and I was just interested in the patriotism of the Jewish people, because you mentioned the medals that people were winning for the independence of Poland, and this is something that my family were involved with and had Jewish roots with the fighting for an independent Poland, and my family are very, very patriotic, and it's very sad for us to hear, a continual discourse about the anti-Semitism in Poland, and for Poland to be continually blamed on this, when obviously Poland was the victim of huge totalitarian regimes. Like, we say the Nazis, but it was the Germans that invaded Poland, and also the Iron Curtain, which was obviously 45 years of a totalitarian regime. I'm just interested in the patriotism, because there's something that's interesting to me, as I'm a singer, and I'm starting to investigate the interwar period, and I'm putting a project together to celebrate the Polish Jewish composers of the 1930s. And obviously their contribution to Polish culture was huge, and yet has not been really explored.
Okay,
in terms of,
so I think the first thing that I want to say to I suppose, excuse myself to some degree, which is to say that I'm not really, it's not a history talk as such that I'm giving. So I'm really, this was a guided tour with a bit of a talk, too much tour of this particular museum. So I would prefer to kind of stay with that as much as possible. But as a brief response, I want to say to you that the uprising, the Polish uprising, the Warsaw uprising of 1863 saw Jews fighting alongside Christians. And the question is, how is this episode being represented now? Right? So when I see it in this museum, in the Polin Museum, the participation of Jews alongside Christians is stressed. But I also went for a walk, outside, and there was a kind of a public display of the heroic history of Warsaw through the ages. And I was very upset to see that the 1863 uprising was depicted, even in the National Museum in Krakow. In the National Museum in Krakow, it has a big place, but it is depicted as if it was just Christian Polish people who had participated. And that upset me profoundly. I found that really difficult. And this is not about 1863. This is about now. This is about how we tell the story now in the present. So that would be, it's not really a response, perhaps, but it's a partial reply to me now. And the now is tremendously political because, I can just share this. In 2015, I can go back to what I didn't show, which was at the beginning, right? We have to see this in context. In 2015, a populist right-wing government was elected, right? PIS, Law and Justice Party was elected. 2019, they were re-elected, right? They put in place a ministry of culture and national heritage, okay? Piotr Gliński. Well, the firing of Dariusz Stolar has to be seen in context, right? Look at this list. The director of the Adam Mickiewicz Institute, fired, right? Dorota Monkiewicz, feminist curator, fired. Head of the Polish Film Institute, fired. I can go on and on and on and on. The director of the Polish Institute in Berlin, fired, allegedly, okay, they deny it, obviously, for programming too much Jewish content. It goes on and on. I feel that, this isn't just about the Jews. This is about many, many things that are going on in many, many parts of some parts of Eastern Europe today, which have to do with the resurgence of right-wing populist governments, which I suppose are one outcome of the major unresolved issues in Eastern Europe to do with the key turning points, after 1980, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and then memory and history. What is the national identity after communism? What can it go back to? What is the history that can be retrieved? And what is the place of Jewish history within national history? It's a very difficult topic. So it's very complicated. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much again. Other people want to ask questions. But I'd be happy to stay in touch about this, but it's very complex. More questions?
I thought your response was fantastic, by the way, so thank you very much. And I really appreciate it. And I'm very interested in the patriotism of Jewish people in Poland, as there's still a very large Jewish community, and we can't forget that either. So, to make everyone's lives easier, it's important to focus on the things that are working as well.
Okay, so that's also not quite my approach. So I'm a very strong believer in a critical engagement with heritage. But that's perhaps because I'm a scholar. I'm not in the business of celebrating. I'm in the business of asking honest questions. that have no simple answers, that are, that are very complex, that are connected with other stuff. Wait, but there were other, Vera wanted to ask a question.
Linda Rosen wanted to ask a question as well. I see.
Linda, can't see everybody, wants to go first. I think Vera has.
Linda?
Hello? Oh.
Yes, Linda.
Hello? Oh, hi. Yes, I have visited the museum a couple of years ago and it was absolutely fascinating, but my visit was far too short. So I hope to go back another time. Is there an extensive education program for school children and young people as part of their curriculum and studies? Because I think that it's so important for young people to be able to access this museum and this narrative.
Okay, so of course I should have said this rather than just giving you a tour, which is that this museum is tremendously committed to education, young, old, everybody. They have an incredible program of education, but also an educators program. So for educators, for teachers, teacher training. Ooh, that's a whole nother talk, but yes. Any more questions, or have I simply knocked you out?
I think Anne has a question, unless there was somebody else who had one first.
Yeah, you were saying that they have the educators program, but do they, in a sense, have lots of school trips from kids within Polish schools going in?
So, I mean, perhaps I should know a little bit more about, I can't quantify, but I know that this is the case. Yeah, I know that, the schools come in, but they also go out to schools. Sometimes you have to go to the mountain, so to speak, but yes, definitely. There's a lot going on. They're very, very committed to education. And of course, they're not the only ones. There's the Jewish Galicia Museum in Krakow, also incredibly committed. And there are also grassroots groups committed to. There's a lot. I mean, if you want to know more about education, I can give you some more references of all sorts of interesting and original and quite wacky and also quite non-standard ways to get through to people and do education.
Oh, I know about all of those. Don't worry.
Good.
Not all of them, but most of them.
Good. Anybody else? Come on, don't be shy.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there a distinction in the period after the partition? Jews fared differently depending on where they wound up, whether it was in the Prussian or Russian or Habsburg parts of Poland. Jews were not all that unhappy about being part of the Habsburg Empire, whereas they suffered a lot from being in the Russian zone. I mean, they lost a lot of rights that they had before. Is that distinction made in the museum?
That distinction is made to some degree, yeah. I mean, I think perhaps, maybe at that point I was possibly getting a little tired. So I should probably go back and, and pay more attention. I spent 2 solid days. I was absolutely exhausted at the end of it. And yeah, I think in retrospect, maybe that could be highlighted a little further, but it was quite clear that, but also there are these big demographic differences. It seems that, Prussia got far fewer Jewish population from this division. This is well known that, those are, the much bigger part was in the east and, and ended up in the Tsarist Empire, which, they pulled the short straw, and of course there were enormous differences. So, what applies to Łódź doesn't apply to other places. It's very true. Thanks. More? Charles, Maurice?
My question was right at the beginning when you showed, as it were, the trees and the beginning. Where was the original migration from? Were people coming from Germany and France, or were they coming, in other words, were they coming from the east or were they coming from the west?
Both. The answer is both. The answer is that there were initially both Jews coming from the Byzantine Empire and even Karaite Jews. There were Karaite communities well into the late Middle Ages in what was then Poland. I don't know whether Karaite rings a bell, but it's Karaites are still around, and there's a variety of Judaism that for example, doesn't accept the various rabbinic sources and so on, but they consider themselves Jewish. So that's from the east. And from the west, that's a slightly later migration, which is mostly the pull factor, and push factor, mostly from German-speaking parts of Central Europe. And that explains Yiddish. That explains why Yiddish is a form of kind of, very close to German. So both.
Shall we take one more question, I think?
Oh.
Charles,
I'm happy to
do you
stay
have
around.
a question?
Charles?
Yes, Charles, can you mute yourself?
Unmute.
How about that?
Better.
There you go.
Okay. We've heard a lot about where Jews have come from and maybe even where they were going in this area, but I haven't heard any real reflections on the connection between Israel, modern Israel particularly, with its large number of Polish immigrants.
Yes.
Can you say something about that?
Yeah. So so this did form part of the kind of the section that concerned post-war, the post-war period, and I should have probably taken more photos, but it's difficult. I mean, actually, there is something that I do want to share with you, which is, well, never mind, I won't now. So the straw that broke the camel's back and that led to the ousting of the extremely highly respected, 2014 to 19 director, Dario Stola, was an exhibition about 1968. And 1968 was moment when student protests in Poland were essentially blamed on the Jews. I'm simplifying a little bit. And a lot of Jewish people left, and some of them, and the point was, it wasn't blamed on Jews, it was blamed on Zionists, right? So this is a very complicated story in which it was difficult for Jewish people it was dangerous, actually, in a way. If you stuck out your head and if you said, I'm Jewish and I want to go to Israel, this was very difficult. It was kind of hard to really have a relationship, an open one, but it was there. It was there. You mean on the part of Jewish people in Poland between 1948 and, let's say, the late 60s? Yeah, it was there. It was one of the questions, should I stay here or should I go to Israel?
Yeah.
Any more?
I think.
Can I ask people a question? Sorry. Can I ask how many people have actually been to Polin, the museum? Aha. Yeah. Okay. Quite a few. That's good. I mean, yeah. Okay. So of course, everybody's impressions will be different from mine, but maybe we can continue the conversation in some other form. You can email me. You can email me anytime.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eva. This has been amazing, really, really interesting. I wanted to say that I'm sure that the museum is struggling financially in this period of the virus, just as every other institution is. Gosh, I hope my internet is not good. I hope you can all hear me. On their website for making donations, if anybody wants to do that. And Kol Nefesh members are welcome to make donations through Kol Nefesh, and then we'll be able to add the gift aid as well. So if Kol Nefesh do it the usual way and let Elaine know what the donation is for. Gosh, I can't tell whether you're hearing me because my internet is,
Yes.
is out.
Yes, it's good.
Yes, okay.
Heard every word of that.
My screen keeps freezing.
So, and I'm going to post my email address if anybody wants to email me about anything to do with the museum, or wants a reading list. So that's, there you are. I think that's correct. Here you are. That's easy. So yeah. So and if you want me to take you around another, preferably a smaller museum, Jewish, I'd happily do that. I mean, I'm an art historian, but I specialize in Jewish museums now. I can do the London one if you want.
Well, that would be lovely. That would be amazing. We'll set that up for another time. Well, thank you again.
It's a pleasure. It was so great to see so many of you. I think that's a real treat. And, you know, it's so wonderful to do something that's outside the university and that's free and there are no fees and whoever wants to come can come and to be able to share stuff. That's fabulous. So, so thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
I can hang around for chatting if anybody wants to stay around and chat. Vera, it's so good to see you.
That would be